Have we started yet?
Yes, we are live on Facebook. Good evening, everyone. My name is Brian Rodgers. I am the Community Relations Liaison at the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center. It is right about 6 o'clock. And so we would like to begin our virtual programs honoring the legacy and life of Dr. Martin Luther King, our program called Beyond Washington. And so before we begin, I would just like to say that the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center or the state of Arkansas. That's just kind of, we kind of have to do that. We don't want anybody to get in trouble. So this week, the country celebrated the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. with parades, speeches, ceremonies, and other activities. His birthday has been celebrated as a state holiday in Arkansas since 1986, and in 2017, it was officially separated from the celebration of the birthday of former Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The Mosaic Templars Cultural Center, Arkansas's Museum of African American History and Culture, has continued in our celebration of the life and legacy of Dr. King with our annual MLK Challenge, which is a program designed for high school students to learn about the life and legacy of Dr. King and to learn about community service. In addition to this annual event, we added the event that you're watching tonight, Beyond Washington. This is an attempt to shine light on the life of Dr. King beyond the March on Washington. And we're doing so because so often his life is reduced to his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. But there's so much more to him and his legacy. We have invited 4 thought leaders in both social justice and the religious community here tonight to talk about the life of Dr. King and his speech, The Other America. And we're going to discuss that tonight. So first, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Preston Clegg, who serves as the pastor of Second Baptist Church in downtown Little Rock, a cooperative Baptist fellowship congregation. He has pastored 4 churches across Arkansas, Texas, and Oklahoma, and earned a bachelor's degree in Christian ministry, a master's of divinity, and a doctorate of ministry. He was called to serve as pastor of Second Baptist Church in 2013, where he has tried to enhance and expand the church's legacy of social justice and inclusion. Next, we have Kwami Abdul-Bey. Kwami, along with his wife Clarice, are the co-founders of the Ouachita Foothills Youth Media Arts and Literacy Collective and the Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement. For their work in these 2 capacities, they have received much national and international recognition and several awards, including the 2021 Arkansas Peace Activist of the Year. Kwami is also the author of The Tables Have Turned, a street guide to guerrilla lawfare, and the founder of Investing in the Black Futures, a social entrepreneurism inventive look at revitalizing south of I-630 in Little Rock. Welcome, Kwami. Next, we have Denise Donnell. Denise is all about the truth. She is a truth seer, a truth seeker, and a truth teller. She devotes all of her time and energy to telling the truth about the truth. The truth about her bio is that none of the academic accomplishments it boasts have anything to do with her personal goals. Denise is an unwilling victim of various systems of oppression that have inadvertently positioned her to be one who can engage people from all walks of life in ways that are meaningful, significant, memorable, and transformative. And last but not least, we have Reverend Haley Jones. She is pastor of community engagement at First United Methodist Church, Little Rock. She believes that the only reason she is a pastor seeking to lead congregations toward relational service and transformative justice is because of her Mississippi roots. As a deacon whose call is to connect the church to the world, she works to journey alongside the faithful, to live boldly in the world in the name of God's kingdom of justice, grace, and hope. Thank you all for being here tonight. Welcome to you all. And as I mentioned to you before we began our live conversation, I am really excited about what this conversation is going to bring tonight. I'm really excited about the progress that we are going to make in making this a more perfect union and trying to work together to achieve Dr. King's dream of a unified country. With that being said, those of you who are watching live on Facebook, we're going to reserve a few minutes at the end if there are any questions from our audience. But right now, let's just get into this. So I did not put this question on the questions that I sent you, but I just want each of you to give us a couple of words about The Other America and what you thought after your initial reading. And we can start with whoever wants to go first. Not everybody at once.
I thought it was pointed. I thought it was the real King. I thought it was a brilliant blend of social critique, deep spirituality, system talk, personal talk. It was the genius of Martin Luther King Jr. At his best, is what I thought.
Anybody else?
Preston, I agree with what you said. I just want to say that it was not an isolated speech. This speech, just like so many more of the speeches that Dr. King gave, had this quality about them. Even the speech that you mentioned earlier, Brian, about I Have a Dream. It's true that America is enamored with that sentence, I have a dream, but very few Americans have actually read that speech either. And that speech is actually as powerful as The Other America. So it was prophetic, it was honest, and it was, like Preston said, it was pointed, and it was the gospel that we need to be following if we do truly and honestly consider ourselves to be the followers of the word, are the image of God, because even in his speeches, he talks about us being in the image of God and what that actually means.
I think my initial reaction is that King is pointed in saying that we are so good at saying yes to the success, but yet we don't finish it. We don't continue to move in the struggle, right? So it's like we celebrate that Civil Rights Act, but yet he's naming we're not done. and equality is not done. And I think that's still the struggle that we're facing today. So, even though, this was many years ago, there's still a struggle that we're facing today in the picture of our society. So it's prevalent, it's poignant. I'm there for that. And he pointed something out to me about the United States of we celebrate a success, but then we don't believe that there's anything else to do behind that. And so what he's saying is yes, where there's a continued journey here always. So I'm glad he was naming that.
My initial reaction was that Dr. King could have very well been delivering this speech this morning. And it would have been just as relevant as it was when he originally spoke the words. And I was reminded that for such a time as this, there are two conversations King reminds us that needs to be happening at the same time. There is a conversation that the collective Black community must have about our role in our own liberation that we can do all by ourselves. And the other conversation that absolutely necessitates white people stepping up into their role of realizing this dream that we have of what America is supposed to be or should be, that we have yet to realize. And so King is pointing out that that we really are, this is the part that I really love, we really aren't living in a white backlash. Like, that's not what we really are dealing with. The system of white inhumanity causes the white backlash, right? And so it is the way that we are treating each other or refusing to treat each other, what we see playing out with the inequalities are a direct result from that. And we have got to get to the point where we realize the fierce urgency of now in order to be liberated as a collective humanity.
Some really interesting initial thoughts. I think the part that kind of, struck me as most, was the section about Vietnam, and talking about justice around the world, how no one people can be free until all peoples are free. And I think that was kind of that touchstone for me, because as Americans, we are ethnocentric and insular, and we kind of view our problems as the problems, and we never stop to think about there are other people in the world who are dealing with similar situations to what I'm dealing with, or even possibly worse oppression and worse conditions than what I'm facing at that particular moment.
Well, this speech was actually given 10 days after his Beyond Vietnam speech. So he was on a trajectory that actually led to his assassination.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you bring up the Vietnam piece, because it was during that section of the speech that King points out that America, just going back to America, has the resources. If we can spend $30 billion or however much on war, if we can spend this much money in other spaces, we can absolutely obliterate the poverty that we are dealing with in America. So the question isn't, do we have the resources? The question is, do we have the will? And the answer that we see right now is crystal clear. We do not have the will. And so that becomes the poignant question. Why don't we want to liberate folks? Why do we need an oppressed people?
Yeah, just talking about its relevance today, we just last month had a filibuster set aside to pass the military defense bill, and then they put the filibuster back in place, and they refused to take it aside to pass the Voting Rights Act. So it's the same thing, Denise. We have the resources. We have an overabundance of resources. We just do not have the desire to ensure that we have an equitable America.
So I wanna start in the questions talking about, why do you think that King is reduced to mainly two things? As we mentioned, the speech at the March on Washington, and his nonviolent approach to the civil rights movement. Why is that what King is reduced to in the media and pop culture and just kind of American society at large?
I think two reasons. Number one, the I Have a Dream speech, if it's read wrongly, as Kwami said, that was a great speech and no less pointed than the one we're talking about tonight. But it can be read in such a way, heard in such a way, that King is proclaiming colorblindness, right? And I think that plays so easily into the narrative that what King wanted is a colorblind society, which subverts justice work. It subverts the peculiar struggle of, and the particular struggle of Black people in this country. And so for people who want to hollow out the teaching of King, I think that I Have a Dream speech plays into that really well. And secondly, he's talking about a dream there. In this sermon, he talks about strategy and plan.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that troubles people too, right? I think as a pastor, I'll speak for faith communities. I think I could go into pretty much any faith community in Arkansas and say racism is wrong and a sin against God and humanity, and everyone in those pews would say amen.
Mm-hmm.
But if I said, because of that, we need to talk about generational poverty, we need to talk about educational justice and the wealth gap and the death penalty and voting rights. Now, hang on just a second, right?
Mm-hmm.
People are a lot more tolerant of dreams than they are strategies. And I think that's why that has such appeal, especially to a lot of white people today.
And you know, Preston, I was watching the video of Mike Huckabee at the governor's residence, or the people's residence, this past Monday morning. And his speech was full of what you were talking about, the I have a dream, the kumbaya, and it did not deal with the substance of what he was talking about. Even if we talk about the I have a dream speech, let's contextualize it, and let's realize that it was done at a march on Washington, a march for poor people, for economic justice on Washington. So we don't even relate that speech to the justice that he was seeking. What we're dealing with is the heroification of history based in a pedagogical colonization of our minds. If we can pull from the Gospel of Chuck D, and we can look at the book, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, and we can read where it says most of our heroes don't appear on no stamp. So what happens is we have an American culture that takes a king and extracts him from the reality that he was actually in and whitewashes him and creates him in their image, because it's all about power. It's all about power. If young little boys and girls knew the true king, and they would be asking for the Other America speech. They would be reciting on Martin Luther King Day the Beyond Vietnam speech. But this is all programmed to ensure that we do not have full access to the real, authentic King.
Yeah, I was going to follow up on that PowerPoint, in that in this, King is speaking in the specifics. He is saying this is what we have to do. And when you speak to specifics, then you're also speaking to people's loss of power. And when it comes to the white community, that becomes they're facing their own power and the loss of that. And then they say, oh, no, I'm not willing to put that work in to challenge that within myself. And so I think the same goes for, when you preach about the kingdom of God, right? There's a bold, beautiful image of what the kingdom of God is. But when it comes to the specifics, speaking from my own church congregation experience, it's a pushback. It's a hard pushback. And I think that's what he's doing is we have that image in I Have a Dream of what could be in beauty and glory. And this is saying, well, this is how we get there. And that becomes the, that we're okay, but he's pushing back.
So I'm sorry, Denise, go ahead.
I don't mind. Do you want to move to the next question?
Yeah. So, because Haley mentioned that loss of power, which kind of leads to which is a good segue to the next question. Over the past few years, we've had cultural touch points to pop up here and there, like the removal of Confederate statues from public spaces and the fight over the alleged teaching of critical race theory in K-12 education. These things have caused like a firestorm of thought and conversation in our country. In The Other America, Dr. King says, and I'll be paraphrasing, that we will never be able to solve the problem of race in America until we have an honest conversation about race and a shared set of established facts about the history of this country. Even though we've all experienced the same history, why is it that we don't share a common set of facts about that history? And Denise, I will let you start on this question since you didn't get a chance to touch on the first one.
And so this is the second question that we are talking about with the Confederates, the touch points.
Yeah, talking about why we as a country don't share a common understanding of the history of this country.
Well, I do think that it is related to the first question about why we focus so much on the I Have a Dream speech and why we focus so much on the fact that Dr. King promoted nonviolence. And it's so that the system of white inhumanity, so that whiteness can control the narrative. And by controlling the narrative, the hope is that they will control the behavior. And so when we begin to, when we preach and teach nonviolence to a group of oppressed people, what we are teaching is that your role is to stay and remain oppressed. So anytime there is any rising up of this people, then there is a backlash and there is retaliation. There's a lot of anger and misunderstanding. How dare you stand up for yourself when your own hero, based on what we said, told you to be nonviolent? And so refusing to share the truth about the speech, the truth about the words behind the speech is indeed intentional. But I just really feel like I want to say this right now before I really answer the second question. But Dr. King's words, the I Have a Dream speech, were inspired by a young Black woman named Prathia Hall. Okay, and so one of the problems that I have with how we center Dr. King is that we do not allow for the conversation to be more broadly discussed about all of the people who work together to make this movement happen. And so Dr. King was inspired by these words, and then at the actual march almost didn't give the speech. It was Mahalia Jackson who reminded him of Prathia Hall's words, two Black women who are whose shoulders King stands on to have this conversation. But yet we don't talk about them. And so when we talk about why we talk about just the I have a dream, it's again, whiteness wanting to control the narrative and thus control the behavior. So you've got these Confederate flags because I want to control the narrative that the statues, the Confederate statues, these are our heroes. These are our patriots. But the truth of the matter is that these were the traitors. They did not want to be a part of the United States of America. They actually said, we don't want to be a part of America so that we can fight to keep our slaves. And so this we don't want to share because we don't want to tell the truth, because if we tell the truth, we have to be held accountable. If we have to be held accountable, we are going to be forced to pay reparations. And these are conversations we don't want to have. And so that's why we don't share, because as long as I keep you in the dark, then I don't have to act on anything.
And you know, you brought up the sister that inspired the I Have a Dream part of the speech. She and there were two other sisters that also inspired the formation of the Poor People's Campaign that King led to Washington. So I definitely agree with you 100%. And it gets back to this heroification of history and this whitewashing of history. I personally believe that, you know, your question, Brian, was you were talking about even though we all experience the same history. I don't believe we experience the same history. I believe, just as Albert Einstein's theory of relativity believes, is that history and time and motion is based on the relativity of the observers. So, and we observe things differently. That's why some people can say they're traitors and others can say that they're heroes, because we're observing them differently. But in that paraphrase that you brought out, the key word was conversation. Yes, we can see it differently. We can have two different viewpoints, but we have to come together and we have to talk about those viewpoints. And I have to be able to explain to you in words that you understand my viewpoint, and you have to do the same for me. And then once we can respectfully do that, then we can move forward with, I can say, more shared values. We may not have shared facts, because we've learned in the last 4 years that facts are not all what they seem to be, because we're two different news agencies have two different set of facts, and they're reporting on the same incident. So I think that it's more important that we deal with that conversation, that dialogue aspect, if we want to get on at least the same page.
You know, my faith tradition teaches that the way we remember is of moral importance, right? One of the most frequent commands in the Hebrew Bible is remember. Remembering is not just a rational exercise. The way we remember is of moral importance. Precisely because of what Denise said. When we talk about remembering, we're really talking about this present moment. And I think the reason that we tend to remember differently is we want to live differently today. But remembering rightly, and I would say it's part of being people of the truth, is of moral importance. And we have to be honest about how we got where we are today.
Yes.
That's not just about our reasoning, that's about our wills and our souls. So I think this is of the utmost importance. And I'll also say it has very little to do with our history, and it has a whole lot to do with propaganda. And until we're able to make that differentiation, I don't know that we're going to get very far.
But our whole history is propaganda. I mean,
Yes.
when we think about the way that it is being taught, the way that it was captured and published for us and given to us, the way that we've been indoctrinated to believe it, all of that is propaganda. And so when I was listening to you, Kwami, you talked about there's a reason why some people can say that the people who fought against the Civil War were heroes, and others can say they were traitors, is because that's their perception, but that's their perception without engaging the truth. And so
Indeed.
propaganda
Correct.
gives you
Correct.
permission to say that
Yes.
these people were heroes, right?
Indeed.
And so
Indeed.
the truth becomes the central, the crux of the matter.
Indeed, and I agree with you 100%. I was coming from the standpoint of I understood the question is, how are we able to solve the problem? We have to solve the problem because we have to, even though there's propaganda and even though there's a dispute of facts, we still have to be able to discuss them and talk about them. That's where I was coming from.
But my concern, though, is that how are we going to talk about it
Yeah.
if you want to stand firm on the fact that these are heroes and I'm telling you that they're, so when do we get to the truth, right? And I think that's why we've been paralyzed. Like, I think that's why we're paralyzed in this moment. That's why there's no movement. That's why there's no traction. That's why we seem to be stifled and stalled, because we're too busy trying to figure out whose perspective deserves the most attention, rather than dealing with the truth of the matter.
Haley?
I was going to say, I think what this question made me think about was the way that present experience eventually becomes our historical narrative, right? So we have to have that shared set of facts and understanding of history of the past, but how are we also understanding that two people can have very different experiences of the present that become the stories that we tell, right? So the narratives that we share about our experience. And I hope I'm tracking in that, but I'm wondering if King was trying to show us this light of, we have two very different experiences in this world, and if we don't face those two very different experiences of the other America, then there is going to be no change of the future and thus our history. And so I was really struck by that of how do we face the fact that there are two stories and two experiences here. So,
and those two experiences are based on the values that we embed in our children. One group embeds this value in their children, another group embeds that value in their children. So the thing that really has to be dealt with is the values that clothe the facts. And I think Preston spoke to that. I agree with you 100%, Denise, is that we have to get to a point where we can agree to what is really the real, but we have to start with people where they are right here and at this moment. And the sad thing is that there's a lot of people that are so far from the what is the truth that we have to figure out some way. We have to go to them and have that conversation with them and bring them to the truth. And that's, I don't know how we're going to do that. I don't know how long that's going to take, how many resources that's going to take, because it seems that we're getting further and further away from this mainline truth that we need to be at.
Well, King speaks to this in the
Yes.
Other America, the Speech for the Other America. And especially those of us, because I know that we are using faith as part of this conversation, this whole idea that we've got to change people's minds, this whole idea that we've got to change people's hearts in order for this work to happen.
Yeah.
And so when you say, Haley, that we have, this becomes our historical narrative, like what's happening now, the experiences become our historical narrative. Actually, what's happening is that we don't have but one narrative, right? We've got somebody controlling the narrative of one experience. And so King is saying, but there's another experience that CRT, the critical race theory, will allow to become part of the dialogue, but you keep refusing it. Those of you who don't want critical race theory, you're saying, I'm denying the other America. I'm denying that there's an entire narrative that exists for folks that creates the conditions that King's asking us to fight about. And we don't want to deal with it because we don't want to talk about it. As a matter of fact, we're not even going to acknowledge it. And so we're spending our time, especially in the faith realm, talking about, well, you know, the Lord gonna help us change the hearts and minds. We need the Holy Spirit to help us pray and change hearts and minds. And King says, yes, 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 we need you to change your heart and mind. But in the meantime, that's not the work I'm most concerned about. I need some legislation that will regulate these behaviors. It won't change their mind, but it'll protect my body. And that's what I need. And so I think that that's another place that gets us caught up, that we're so busy trying to make people comfortable so that we can get to the point that they can see that there's another narrative, and we begging them to help us come into the light with this narrative. And King says that work is only part of what needs to happen. And we cannot spend all of our time there.
I want to go back to something that Haley said about these different perspectives. One of the things that we learn as young historians is that our personal biases affects the way we retell history. And as the gatekeepers of history, and because that's what historians are, we are the griot of the community. We're preserving the history. Those biases that we have seep into the way we record the history. So if I'm recording, you know, the history of a particular event, and I have that implicit bias against what's happening, then the way I record that story is going to be a little different than the way someone who is all in favor of the event records the story. And I think that's how we got to where we are today, right? Because at the end of the Civil War, there was a school of historians who were mainly concerned with maintaining the honor of the South. And so the way they recorded the stories became the story of the aggression of the North, and the fact that the South was fighting the war to maintain the balance of state and federal rights. And so the way we record history, the way we tell history, determines how the future views of past events happen.
And I will add to that is when we tell it, because you talk about those historians. Their efforts were amplified by the Daughters of the Confederacy. Not only were they putting up statues all over the South, and actually in the North and West as well, but they were also ensuring that history books in K through 12 schools had that story that you talk about published inside of them.
Right, they developed the curriculum that was being taught in the schools.
Yes.
So that's why King is forcing us to talk about the other America, because it doesn't exist in these books, because they want to control the narrative. They want to control the story and feed us what they want us to know and believe. We have been programmed very well, I might add.
To bring us back to, kind of the question of a set of shared facts. How do we begin to come to grips with this shared history? Because after apartheid, we saw the Truth and Reconciliation committees. Whether those worked or not, I think is still up for debate, but that was an attempt to come to grips with a common story.
Mm-hmm.
How do we come to share one history of America and to start to move away from, as Denise so eloquently put it, the propaganda of the history of America?
I think the number one thing that has to happen is for Black people in particular to be enlightened on who we really are. I feel like Black people in America in particular, we may as well be living in the Matrix. So what the world that we are shown, the world that we are walking in, the world that we are navigating is actually not real. It's a lie. It's based on a lie. It's rooted in a lie. We are great people who come from greatness, who were designed to be great, who carry greatness in the marrow of our bones. And we have everything that we need to live independently and to construct every institution that will work in our favor. But all of us don't know that, because we've been fed the lie. So much so that just by nature, we believed it, because if you hear something over and over and over again, it's natural to believe it. And so part of this collective liberation has to be the revolution of Black folks. And that is going on now. I'm not saying it hasn't started, but that's what has to happen. And I think that knowledge that we embed in people, once we begin to feed and nurture it, that knowledge will grow up in us a resistance that cannot be stopped. And we're going to talk about about this a little later on in the questions, but you won't be able to stop it. And that's where we are now. We're at this tilting point, right? You aren't going to be able to stop the revolution that's already happening, and it's going to continue to happen the more we are enlightened. So the work of helping Black people see ourselves for who we really are and not for who we've been programmed to believe we are is part of this solution to having one history, because we'll be talking about the truth as we know it and not the lies that we've been told.
You mentioned, Brian, the apartheid from South Africa, and very few people know that Dr. King spoke out against apartheid in South Africa in several of his speeches. My adopted grandfather, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who just recently transitioned, he was part of that process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And he talked about how the apartheid that they fought against in South Africa currently exists today in other parts of the world, particularly in Palestine. And when I think about what can be done, what can we do right here in Arkansas, is we have to take these examples that have been given to us and apply them to our own present day experience, one thing that Clarice and I have been fighting for over the last 3 years is the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Arkansas that would begin that process of doing the education that we're talking about, not only educating little Black children, but educating little white children, because they've also been fed lies and deceit and everything, but not just the little children, but the elders who are set in their ways as well. So I think that any discussion along those lines has to deal with, as King stated and as Denise so eloquently punctuated, it has to have some type of public policy aspect. You have to literally set up the rules, set up the laws, and say, this is what you will do. And that might not change your heart right away, but it will stop you from doing X, Y, and Z, so that those people who are your victims, are the descendants of your victims, can first and foremost begin to have a sigh of relief and start their own process of dealing with the trauma, historical trauma that they've dealt with because of this matrix that they've been thrown into.
Haley or Preston, do you have anything in this, kind of thought process?
One of the things that I find myself doing is facing. I say to my congregation, let's look at our bookshelves, right? Like, who are the voices that are primary on your bookshelves, and what are the additional voices that we need to be adding into this? We have got to quit reading and using voices that all look the same, right? And so that's the constant history that we're telling ourselves, but there is a different history that we must proclaim. And let me show you these voices and read these voices and put those on your bookshelves for your sons and your daughters to see as well. So that was just a little side note that I was pondering over here.
Okay, Preston, did you have something? I didn't want to.
Go ahead.
Okay, I just want to remind our viewers watching on Facebook, thank you for joining us tonight. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And at the end, we'll save some time and we'll get to your questions in the chat if you have any. So again, thanks for watching. Now, I want to move on, kind of skip around for a moment, because both Kwami and Denise addressed the next point that I want to kind of discuss. And Preston, I want you to start on this thought. King mentions that laws can't change hearts, but they can restrain them. And I thought that was, such an amazing thought, because in high school, I was in debate. And one of the things that we learned in debate is that you can't legislate intent. You can't legislate people's feelings. But I never thought about legislation can restrain people's intent. And so King mentions that in his speech. And so, Preston, if you would, just take a couple of, moments and talk about, your thoughts about legislation restraining people's intent, restraining their hearts.
Yeah, a couple of things that I want to say about that. I think there is a reflex amongst a lot of white people to think of racism as interpersonal animus, right? And when you define racism that way, then you can avoid all legal and political ramifications of it. And I think sometimes this reflex of you can't legislate morality becomes cover for systemic and political racism. Slavery in this country wasn't just one person's bad idea. It was inscribed into the laws of this country. And if we're not going to get political about it and speak about legislation, then we're not going to get at the real problem. I don't think that any of us would say if we had right laws, it would fix every aspect of our humanity, right? There are probably places of our humanity that laws can't touch. You can't force love. You can't force like real deep compassion. However, you can, and King says this in this speech, you can curb destructive behavior with law. And when it comes to Black bodies and the well-being of Black bodies and the safety of Black bodies, then that becomes the prevailing concern, not the hearts of white folk in that moment. So I think that's what King is getting at here is while laws can't do everything, they can do something, and we should utilize them for that purpose. Probably no one has influenced my thinking in this regard more than Howard Thurman, one of MLK's teachers, yes, who actually says that we should think of laws aspirationally. And I think he uses the word tutor, like we should think of laws as our moral tutors. They reveal to us who we are aspiring to be. And so even though legislation will not fix everything that ails us at the deepest levels of our humanity, it can curb the worst of our humanity, and it can become aspirational for us as a country.
And I just want to take a moment based on what Preston just said to actually read just that little bit of what King says about this legislation. And so King says, let me say another thing which gives the other side. And that is that although it may be true that morality cannot be legislated, behavior can be regulated. Even though it may be true that the law cannot change the heart, it can restrain the heart less. Even though it may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, it can restrain him from lynching me. Those are King's words.
And he went on to say, I think that's pretty important.
You know, when I read that section, I thought about an analogy my pastor used to use, talking about the law in a biblical sense. Mm-hmm. He said that a speed limit sign doesn't stop me from speeding, but lets me know when I do. And I think that looking at these the idea of legislating to prevent people from doing things, right? If it's, some people take the approach that if it's not against the law, then it's okay for me to do it. And I think that is kind of where we get into trouble, is because no, we can't legislate everything, but at times we need laws to let people know, hey, this we don't approve of.
And Brian, even taking what your pastor said a little further is what that street sign that gives you the speed limit does is it tells you, okay, this is the standard that you're going to be held to. If you choose not to live by that standard, there are consequences to you making that decision. So when we look at these laws and we look at this public policy, we have to look at it the same way. We're not trying to change your behavior. We're trying to tell you, if you choose to do this, then there will be consequences. So you have to decide what you're going, whether or not you're going to abide by that, and whether or not you're going to suffer the consequences. The problem is that we still have this structural violence that is being waged against people of color, where even those consequences that are set up are dished out totally differently based on how you look when you walk into that courtroom. So that's still even another aspect of the legislation piece as well.
And that's why King is pushing us to talk about the other America. Because
Yes.
in the other America, yes, there are speed limits and there are stop signs and there are red lights and there are laws, there's legislation, but the consequences are null and void, because the people who kill our bodies, the people who murder us in the street and have our blood running down the sidewalk, they do it with impunity. And so King says, so the narrative that we put forth is that the justice system works, right? That's the narrative that we put forth, right? That the court system works, you know, that we trust our jury system. That's the narrative that's been written for us. But Black people live in the other America that says, oh, just because you have the consequences and the repercussions, not everybody is held accountable. So that takes us right back to the question of, where is our will to hold people accountable? How can you sleep at night knowing that you let a murderer go free? And that's directly tied to your history as a colonizer, killing folks and going free. So we have to include all of these conversations if we are going to change this world.
Yes, yes, indeed.
So in that same section, King talks about, he says, we will never have an integrated society until people are obedient to the unenforceable. And it's often that the goal is not integration, but desegregation, right? So when we talk about 1954 and Brown versus the Board of Education, we don't talk about integrated schools. We talk about desegregating the schools that we had. I want to know what you all think about people being obedient to the unenforceable. What does that mean to you?
The first thing that came to my mind when you asked that question was former police officer Derek Chauvin and his inability to be obedient to the unenforceable. When you talk about desegregation and integration, the difference between the two is desegregation is a public legal process, while integration is a private social process. So you can have desegregated schools all you want, but you have a problem because you don't have integrated neighborhoods, because certain people don't want you living next to them, and the problem with that is the process of desegregation in and of itself, that public legal process, it's done in a way where it's not an equitable process, because it's done where winner takes all. Whereas you have a Black school and a white school, when you talk about desegregating, what you're talking about is shutting down that Black school and taking those resources out of that community and shipping the students that went to that Black school over to a white school. It never happens where you shut down a white school and take resources out of that community and then ship all the white students to a Black school. So there, even in itself, as Denise keeps reminding us, it's the other America. It's how one segment of the population experiences reality in America versus another segment of the population that experiences reality in America.
Earlier on in this conversation, Haley mentioned the word power. I think that's a part of how at least I differentiate between those two in my own mind as well. I think you can desegregate without a power shift, but true integration, and I mean that in the best sort of integration, not integration as a cover for assimilation, right? I mean the best sort of integration is there's a power shift, there's a justice element. You can desegregate and say there's room at this table for everyone, but integration gives everyone an equal say in the menu, right? And those are two separate things. And I think in this country, we've done more desegregation than we have the best of integration. And most of what we call integration is really just assimilation by another name. To me, what I think King means when he talks about obedient to the unenforceable, not to be reductionistic, I think he's talking about love, like deep Christian, human, authentic, gritty, just love that wills the good of other people. And that gets really difficult to force people to do. But I think a true just society will always elude us until we're willing to really and genuinely love people, right?
You know, Preston, when you're talking about that love, I'm looking at the speech where he talks about this aspect of society being integrated versus desegregated. And he talks about the need for white America to have empathy for the pain, agony, and burdens of Black America.
Well, I think that for me, I struggle with these two words because I feel like they're on the same plane. I feel like we desegregate. I feel like King's, the movement, let me talk about it as a movement, the movement that King was the voice of, the goal was to desegregate to integrate, right? So the point is to get rid of the racial bias so that we can be one humanity and treat it as such. And so I feel like it was a journey, and the journey has been disrupted. And that I think we're still on that journey, but again, the disruption. And so this comment that we have in the chat is, to me, it is a perfect picture of what this disruption is. The chat says there are 30 laws across the country that restrict voting, and no federal law prevents these restrictions. The court system nor laws protect our justice. Last night, we witnessed the defeat of the John Lewis Voting Act. So the desegregation piece would be, well, now everybody can vote, right? But then for you to have these restrictions in place and for you to defeat the John Lewis Voting Act, that shows that you're not looking for integration. So you disrupt the journey that we are supposed to be on, and therein lies the problem, in my opinion. So when King says, how are we going to be obedient to the unenforceable? Then I think we are talking about love. We're talking about these changed hearts and these changed minds, but we're also talking about humanity. Like, yes. I can't enforce you. I can't make you see me as a human. You've got to see that for yourself. And if you say that there is something that's bigger than you, surely that something should have the power to help you see God in every single person that walks across your path, and however you define God. I'm not trying to define God in any certain kind of way, but to me, that's the problem. I feel like we are certain, when we talk about religion, We have a faith in many cases that's useless, because if your
Yes.
faith does not make you stay awake all night trying to figure this out, you can sleep like a baby when you
Yes.
know children are hungry, when you know that people are not receiving adequate health care, when you know people don't make sustainable wages, when you know that education is not a reality for some, how your spirit should not be at rest. And so King says you got to be obedient to that which is way down deep inside of you that nobody else can reach but you.
Yes.
I want to even though this is good, this conversation about integration versus desegregation is good, and it's even, one of the debates going on within the African American historical community. I want to kind of move us to another topic along the same lines. One of my favorite scenes from Spike Lee's Malcolm X movie is the scene in jail where the inmate is talking to Malcolm about the power of words and how the difference in the way the way white is defined versus the way black is defined. And even King notes this in his speech. He talks about how white supremacy is built into the English language. And he says that if you open up the thesaurus and you look at the synonyms for black, you'll find there's about 120 of them, and they focus on things like dirty and smut and degrading and low. But the synonyms of white represent something high like pure and chaste, and the line from the Malcolm X movie is like pure white snow. King goes on to say that this phenomenon of language creates an inherent difference in how the value of white life versus black life. I wonder, from the four of you, how do we combat this value that language has, and how do we start to move black bodies into being valued, right? One could even argue that the ways in which black is defined also plays psychological, or also has psychological effects on black people themselves in valuing other black lives. Somebody come on.
There's been a lot of faith talk tonight, but you got ministers on the screen. I think about the Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus warns us about our words. You've heard it said, don't murder. But I say to you, anyone who calls your brother raka in Hebrew, it's like you're spitting on them, right? You fool is how it's translated. You're well down the path of murder already. I think that is Jesus saying that real hatred, violence, is born in our language. It doesn't end there, but it is born in our language. And if we don't tend to our words, our hands will begin to act on them. I think we sort of diminish the power of language in our culture, but in the Hebrew mindset, worlds are created with words, right? To bring that to present day, just this week, I heard a U.S. senator say, Black people vote as much as Americans. And if you think about the logic of that statement and what that is really saying, what came out of his mind to say that. Yeah, exactly. Black folks aren't Americans is what that means. Or when we drive around and say, that's a bad school, or that's a good school. What does that mean? Bad and good. Those are value judgments. What do we mean by that? And I think those are just small examples of the way hatred and dehumanization creep into our language. Sometimes we're totally unaware of it, which makes it more insidious, right? More dangerous. Sometimes we are aware of it and we do it anyway. But I don't know how to combat that except to call our attention to the fact that the way we speak to each other and about each other is of moral importance. Words are the beginning of deeds.
And I think that I want to go with Preston here, if you don't mind me riding your coattail, Preston. I want to go with you here to say there's also a scripture that says, out of the abundance of the heart, man speaks. So if these words are so powerful, when you're pushed up against the wall, that which is way down deep is what comes out. So when we hear you say this is a bad school, that's because in your heart of hearts, that's what you believe based on everything we've been saying, the lies that the person writing the story has told. So if we don't get this other story out there, if we don't recognize and acknowledge this other America, then the power that the words of the other America carries continues to be silenced. So the words have power, yes, and every story is filled with words. So every story is powerful. So the story of the other America must be heard, which is what King is saying. But because of what the question was before this, how do we be obedient to the unforceable? I can't get to what's in your heart that's making you say and believe these things. So one of the things we have to do is get people to do your own work. Mm-hmm. People have to decide for themselves that they're going to do some work. White people, y'all need to get y'all white people and help them do their work. Black people, we need to get our Black people, help them do our work. People of color, we need to get our people of color people, and we've got to help each other do our work. But we are not going to make as much progress as we could, as fast as we should, if people do not examine themselves and their own hearts, which would help them govern their mouths. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, you're good. It also made me think that we can't really answer this question without also going back to the set of shared facts and the historical narrative, right? And I think Ibram X. Kendi does that in stamped from the beginning. That's his whole trajectory is tracing the way that language has influenced the story that's told. And so I think it's absolutely crucial to know the root of where that comes from in the historical narrative, so we can begin to shift that story into a new light.
Thank you for punting it to me like that, Haley, because I'm gonna tell you exactly where it came from. Brian, I love that movie. I love Spike. He was one of my professors in film school. So I remember when I first saw that scene in the movie Malcolm X, and me being someone who is really governed by etymology of words. I looked up the etymology of the word Black, and it was very interesting. I was very interested to learn that the definitions of Black that we currently hold as being bad, as being dirty, as being smut, as being degrading, as being low, that is not the original definition of the word. That definition came into play in the 15th century. What was happening in the 15th century? The Spanish Inquisition, where they were kicking the Moors and the Jews out of Europe, the Catholic Church was. And the usage of the word Black as being bad, it was first recorded during the Grenada War in 1482, and it ended in 1492. What happened in 1492? Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. All of this is connected. Christopher Columbus wasn't lost. He was chasing Moors, trying to kill them.
So Preston, I think this comment from Phyllis Brown is also the one that was pointing us to the Voting Rights Act and its defeat in the earlier comments that were made. but I think this is for you. It says, and I think anybody can respond, but I think it's for you, Preston. Unaware of the words / language we use, that stupefies me. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I don't mean to say that people are unaware of the language they use. I think we use words with intention. What I do think happens is that some people have been indoctrinated in language, right? And don't know all the layers of meaning that are carried with a word or a phrase or a metaphor. And so I do think sometimes language slips up on people, but oftentimes that happens because they've been indoctrinated in certain language with malintention and the utmost intention, if that makes sense. So yeah, I'm not trying to excuse dehumanizing language to any degree. I do think some people aren't aware of all the layers of language in this regard.
Guys, we're getting close to 7:30. I do want to save some time. There are a few questions from our Facebook Live audience, but I want to wrap up with the idea that King brings up as a solution to social inequality. He brings up universal basic income. And listen, I know that none of you on the call are economists, but it seems that people have thoughts about universal basic income. Do you think that economic justice will move us closer to social justice? Anybody?
Yes, economic justice cannot be separated from social justice. It cannot be separated from racial justice. This idea of a universal basic income, it actually goes back to the sister that Denise talked about earlier, who influenced King's I Have a Dream speech. She's also part of the group of sisters that influenced King's thoughts on a universal basic income. And in his writings, when he wrote about the universal basic income in his second book, I cannot think of the title of it right this second, but he wasn't talking about it from the standpoint of what we think about it today is a livable minimum wage of what, $15 an hour. He wasn't talking about it from that standpoint. He was talking about it from the standpoint of everybody in America having a base salary that is given to them by the government, and that universal basic income. I did a little bit of research on King's advocacy for that, and I learned that Nixon was actually influenced by King's push for universal basic income, so much so that during his re-election campaign, he promised that everyone in America would have a universal basic income through the creation of, I think it was called the American Family Program, where they were going to do away with what is known as welfare and ensure that every American, no matter who they were, would as long as they had less wealth there was a baseline wealth, and if you were below that baseline, you would get what is in dollars today, the equivalent dollars today is $1,000 a month, and that is something that is actually workable. It was actually shown during this pandemic that it can be done. But we have to go back to the will and the hearts of people to actually do the right thing. The goal of King's goal in advocating for this was he wanted to make sure that everyone had basic needs taken care of as far as food, clothing, and shelter. As long as you can get your food, clothing, and shelter taken care of, then that should be a starting point instead of starting from having absolutely positively nothing.
One of the lines that I highlighted and underlined was, and I'm convinced that many of the very people who supported us in the struggle in the South are not willing to go all the way now. So personally, yes, I do believe economic justice is a part of this justice that King is calling for. And so I think he's challenging us, and he's saying, in addition to the violence against physical bodies, there is a violence against the mental, spiritual, educational aspects of people's lives. And so when we have people who live in poverty, when we have educational inequity, when we have housing inequity, there is still a violence against bodies, against their mental, emotional states. And so there is justice to be done, and a significant part of that is economic. And so I think that is what he's saying is we can't just support one aspect of this. That's not going all the way. There is an arc that we are aiming for, in a wholeness, in a unity of success for people.
So there's a couple of questions from the chat that I want to get to before we wrap up. One question says, while I am grateful for these types of necessary platforms, what can we collectively do to move the city, county, state, and United States of America forward honestly and truthfully? And then there's a second part that says, what is going to be the real next level of getting to the next?
The thing that we can do is organize and mobilize people to vote. Right? That is we have got to vote. Everybody has to vote. And there are people among us who understand this, the situation that we are in the same ways that we do. And there are those people who are positioned to be political leaders in this space to help us get the work done, to help us reach our goal of true integration. And so we've got to be voting those people into office so that we can have a real dialogue about this change. Because for me, when you ask the question about economics, will that get us economic justice? Will that get us closer to social justice? Yes, but not as an isolated entity. And so when you see these words that we have in the chat right now, the words in the Constitution deliberately and intentionally excluded women and enslaved Africans in America. Tom Cotton, who is one of our political leaders, was intentional when he said slavery was a necessary evil. Those words are intentional. John Hubbard, who is a political leader, Jonesboro state legislator, said slavery may have been a blessing. So when you have those kinds of people feeling that kind of way, dealing with economics and dealing with education and dealing with housing, it's no wonder we're in the state that we are in. So what do we need to do? We need to vote, not just talk about voting, but we need to mobilize people and get them to the polls so that we can change the structures that govern us. I think that's part of the equation.
And I think added to that, Denise, that voting aspect is we need to have electoral justice, voter registration, education, and participation. When we go back to the example that King and the SCLC and SNCC provided for us, they had voting clinics. So when you have a certain county or a certain state that has certain laws, policies, and regulations that that are essentially voter suppression, they taught the people how to get around that suppression. When you look at in some places where you can't, all of the voting precincts are shut down in some parts of the city to increase the traffic in one precinct in one area to decrease the people from voting. What you do is you learn those new laws, those new voter suppression laws, and you develop a curriculum to teach the people how to get around them so that they can vote, and so that we can't just sit around talking and complaining about they have suppressed the vote and they've taken our opportunities to vote away from us. Let's get around these hurdles, then let's vote, and then let's vote people in there that will undo and get rid of these hurdles.
Another question in the chat says, if the majority of slave owners and people who voted last night were Christians, how does this conversation about Jesus help us?
Wow. I got 3 qualified people that can answer that.
Yeah, it shows us that religion can cement us in our injustice as much as it can prompt us towards justice. And that is a hard thing for a Christian minister to admit. But there are some expressions of my own faith, my own Christian faith, that buttress injustice and do it in the name of God. And I think that has to be named and called out and repented of. I also think, we're talking about a speech tonight from a Baptist minister. I also think we need to take that seriously. And what prompted this wisdom, courage, love in Dr. King? I think it was primarily his faith. So I want to be honest about both of those things. I think faith and my own Christian faith can give rise to the most beautiful humanity as we see exhibited tonight. I also think my faith can be warped and twisted so that it supports and sanctions the worst of humanity. And that has to be named and called out as well. And that's not just true today, by the way. That's true throughout human history. It's true in the Bible. Some religion is dangerous religion. Some religion is redemptive and sacred religion.
And for me, I think that we have to, for me, Denise, that the words that we use, the words that I use, have to be a little more harsh. Much of the way that we have been indoctrinated to practice, particularly Christianity in the Western tradition, is a lie. And it's rooted in a lie. And so when we start talking about narratives and who's controlling the narrative and who has the power, much of what we are practicing in Christianity today is what we received from the slave masters. Right? That's truth. And so then I can understand the question, like, so how does this Jesus serve me? The answer is that Jesus does not, point blank, period, does not. And so the work of the faith leader has to be reframing Jesus so that we can get to the truth about who Jesus was meant to be for us, so that Jesus can then compel us to do the work. So I would not invite anybody into a space for this Jesus we've been indoctrinated to believe, who as a matter of fact, we call it Bloody Sunday because people sat up and praised Jesus and then walked out on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and slaughtered Black folks in the street. So we've got to denounce this Jesus with all of our vigor and make sure that we begin to teach who the true risen Christ really is. Oh, here's some, and then Phyllis says, remember, Christianity was used to justify and maintain slavery. Slave, obey your master. That's in the Bible.
Slavery was a Christian institution.
Say that again, Kwami.
Slavery was a Christian institution.
Well, I hate to,
Wait, but Brian, wait, I just really need to say this. And members of the Ku Klux Klan, part of the criteria was that you were Christian.
Yes.
You could not be a member if you, oh, see, Brian, you cutting us off now. Now you ready to go, Brian.
well, it's 7:30,
Okay.
and I hate to end the conversation here, but our time is done. It doesn't mean that these conversations can't continue. Doesn't mean that you can't call up somebody, have a cup of coffee, and you guys continue these conversations. But our time tonight is done. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everyone who was with us on Facebook Live. Please remember to check our Facebook page for upcoming events. It's the beginning. We're moving into Black History Month. So please come by the museum and pick up one of our 2022 Black History Month calendars that detail all of our upcoming events. Again, thank you all, and thanks for watching tonight.